What a curious thing it is that mankind spends the better part of its existence fleeing from its own dawn. Men and women labor under the tragic illusion that the passage of years is synonymous with the departure of youth, believing that the early chapters of their lives are merely discarded skins, left behind in the dust of history. We look at old photographs, we recall distant fragments of laughter or terror, and we comfort ourselves with the notion that maturity has erased those primitive beginnings. We convince ourselves that childhood is a closed room, a mere collection of faded memories, resolved traumas, or silly behaviors that the cold light of adult reason has successfully dissolved. Yet, throughout my decades of sitting in the quiet sanctuary of my consulting room, listening to the agonizing confessions of the soul, I have discovered a reality that radically shatters this comforting delusion. The child has not vanished. It has not died, nor has it been left behind in the corridors of time. Within the hidden depth of every grown individual, beneath the most formidable exterior and behind the most sophisticated intellect, there lives a child. I am not speaking here of a romantic sentiment, a poetic metaphor, or a passive memory locked away in the attic of the brain. I am speaking of a living, dynamic psychic entity, a force of nature inhabiting the bedrock of your psyche. It is what I have come to recognize as an active archetype, an autonomous center of energy operating silently, relentlessly, in the dark waters of the adult mind. It works upon you at this very moment. It is the invisible director of your silent thoughts. It is the hand that mysteriously sabotages your most calculated decisions. It is the veil that distorts your most precious relationships, and the subtle architect shaping the entirety of your destiny. Do not mistake this inner presence for a dormant, sleeping ghost waiting to be forgotten. Quite the contrary, it acts as a profound and often volatile reservoir of raw energy. It holds within its hands the two extreme poles of human nature. On one side, it guards the purest qualities of our species, our uncorrupted capacity for wonder, our instinctual sensitivity, our unfettered intuition, and that precious, untamed spark of creativity that makes life worth living. But on the other side, it bears the weight of our oldest, most unbearable wounds. It carries the cold ache of early abandonment, the sharp sting of rejection, the silent humiliation of being misunderstood, and the deep, abiding horror of emotional invalidation. In my clinical practice, I observed time and again that the vast majority of human suffering in adulthood does not stem from current misfortunes, but from the systemic repression of this foundational presence. We do not learn how to look at this child, nor do we know how to hold it or integrate its power into our daily lives. Instead, the modern world teaches us to conceal it. We construct elaborate masks of maturity. We hide behind prestigious social roles. We weave complex intellectual rationalizations. And we surrender to numbing vices, all to keep this vulnerable creature locked safely in the basement of the unconscious. And for this tragic act of denial, we pay a price beyond measure. We suffer from baffling neuroses, crippling existential dread, chronic and unexplainable anxiety, and the suffocating bonds of emotional codependency. We walk through life plagued by a persistent feeling of inner emptiness, endlessly repeating the same destructive patterns in a desperate, blind loop. You must understand a fundamental law of the psyche. What is denied consciousness does not cease to exist, it merely returns as fate. This child does not evaporate simply because you choose to ignore it. The more violently you push it down into the shadows, the more cunningly it manifests itself in disguised, chaotic, and destructive ways. When you see a fully grown adult erupt into a blinding fury over a minor critique, or when you witness someone who feels perpetually invisible in their marriage, constantly begging for approval from authority figures, or completely incapable of drawing a firm boundary to protect their dignity, you are not merely looking at someone who is being childish in a petty sense. No, you are witnessing an adult who has been completely possessed by a wounded child, It is that unseen, unheeded part of themselves that was never witnessed, never comforted, and never understood, now seizing the controls of the personality to demand what it was denied. Herein lies the most delicate, yet infinitely powerful realization of my psychological work. This inner child does not require a cure, as though it were a disease or a psychological defect. It does not need to be eliminated. It demands to be recognized. It requires a legitimate sacred space within the adult psyche. True psychological development, what I have termed the process of individuation, can never occur through the rejection or denial of our early nature. It occurs through the careful cultivation of what I call the internal paternal ego. By this, I mean the development of an inner capacity to govern and nurture oneself from within, establishing a conscious living dialogue between the wounded, vulnerable aspect of your nature and the strong, protective aspect of your mind. This is the true genesis of emotional maturity. It is not the stoic repression of pain, but the courage to listen to it. It is not the performance of invincibility, but the painstaking construction of genuine inner solidity. I invite you now to embark upon a quiet journey into the forgotten depths of your own psyche. Look beyond the smooth veneer of your daily persona and dive into the realization that this hidden child is not an embarrassing obstacle on your path toward adulthood. It is, in truth, the ultimate key to unlocking your authenticity, your creative power, and your ultimate emotional freedom. To understand this dynamic is far more than a mere therapeutic exercise. It is an absolute necessity for psychic survival in an era that demands our total disconnection from the soul. Perhaps, by having the courage to look directly into the eyes of the child we once were, and secretly still are, we may finally comprehend why we walk through this life feeling so profoundly exhausted, so lost, and so desperately needy. The resolution was never to be found in the outside world. It has been waiting inside you all along, small, sensitive, and invisible, waiting for you to finally turn around and look. When I speak of archetypes, I am not proposing abstract theories or poetic metaphors cooked up in an academic study. I am describing dynamic, living structures deeply rooted in the collective unconscious of humanity. They are psychic organs, as real and influential as the physical organs of the body, shaping our behaviors, filtering our perceptions, and firing our emotions with a primordial force that completely transcends logic or conscious reason. Among these eternal patterns of the mind, few possess a power as immediate and transformative as the archetype of the child. What my research revealed was not a dead memory, but a living engine of psychological life. This inner entity remains fully operational within us, regardless of how many decades we have walked the earth. It is not trapped in the past like an insect frozen in amber. It is alive in your present moment. It speaks through your instantaneous emotional reactions, your deepest unfulfilled longings, your most irrational panics, and the precise manner in which you reach out to or pull away from the world around you. It is natural for men and women to assume that when we speak of the child within, we are merely indulging in nostalgia, remembering the playgrounds, the classrooms, or the specific family homes of our youth. But my proposition reaches much deeper into the soil of the soul. The archetype of the child is the symbol of the emerging self, the grand total of who you are meant to become. It represents both the very origin of your psychological journey and the infinite, unrealized potential for transformation that lies ahead. It is a paradox, at once profoundly fragile and utterly sacred. Within its nature resides the pure essence of spontaneity, emotional fluidity, unsophisticated curiosity, and raw, creative genius. Yet, alongside these magnificent gifts, lie our most terrifying vulnerabilities, unprocessed traumas, terrifying helplessness, inherited shame, and the cold agony of isolation. This hidden presence exerts a subtle yet often devastating sway over the adult life. When it is ignored, starved of attention, or swept under the rug, It will manifest through behaviors that appear entirely absurd to the rational mind. It reveals itself in sudden explosive outbursts of rage, in irrational surges of jealousy, in an insatiable craving for constant validation, and in a crippling dread of abandonment that can destroy even the most promising relationships. How many adults do we see who have achieved everything the world deems important, individuals holding positions of immense authority, commanding industries, raising families, and projecting an image of unshakable success, who are, in reality, completely governed by a terrified 6-year-old sitting on the throne of their psyche? The archetype of the child cares nothing for your social status, your bank account, or your academic titles. It cares only to be heard. The archetype possesses a profoundly dual nature. It can serve as the divine bridge toward our ultimate psychological healing, or it can act as the primary wellspring of our deepest neuroses. When it is properly integrated into the conscious mind, we gain access to boundless energy, brilliant intuition, and a natural lightness of spirit. But when it is repressed and cast into the shadow, it will systematically sabotage everything we attempt to build with our conscious intellect. To sever your connection with this inner child is tantamount to amputating a vital piece of your soul. Any system of personal growth, philosophy, or spiritual endeavor that attempts to bypass this reconnection is fundamentally flawed and doomed to failure. However, we must be precise in our understanding, for the inner child does not present a uniform face to the world. In my work with hundreds of patients, I observed that this archetype manifests in distinct forms, each possessing its own peculiar needs, grand capabilities, and dangerous distortions. Some of these aspects take control of our lives in silent, unseen ways, while others scream desperately for recognition. To truly liberate ourselves from their unconscious tyranny, we must learn to recognize their distinct features. These manifestations are not rigid, artificial classifications, but fluid psychic structures that interweave to form the unseen foundation of human behavior. By recognizing these forms, we can finally trace our most automatic, painful adult reactions back to their true origins. The first of these distinct expressions is the wounded child. This aspect bears the direct marks of our early history, the explicit traumas of physical or verbal violence, alongside the insidious, implicit wounds of emotional neglect, cold indifference, and the systematic invalidation of our true feelings. It is this fragile part of the psyche that learned, long ago, that to express a genuine need was dangerous, that to cry out for love was to invite humiliation, and that to trust another human being was an invitation to suffer. When this wounded child remains unintegrated, banished to the unconscious, it dictates the adult life through a pervasive fear of real intimacy. It breeds chronic anxiety, fuels destructive codependent relationships, and maintains an unrelenting state of emotional hypervigilance, a constant scanning of the horizon for impending betrayal. It creates a profound echoing void within the chest that no amount of worldly success, fame, or material wealth can ever fill. It is the wounded child within you that misinterprets a partner's quiet mood as an existential threat, senses rejection where none exists, and continually forces you to abandon yourself before anyone else can abandon you. The second expression is the puer aeternus, the eternal child. Where the wounded child is trapped in the trauma of the past, the eternal child lives in perpetual flight from the present. This is that dynamic aspect of the psyche that violently refuses to grow up, to accept the necessary weight of responsibility, or to endure the ordinary frustrations of earthly reality. It lives in constant pursuit of novelty, craves immediate gratification, demands unearned admiration, and harbors a visceral terror of commitments, limits, and routine. In the adult, the eternal child manifests as chronic procrastination, an inability to build anything lasting, a pattern of unstable romantic entanglements, and a suffocating feeling that the demands of adult life constitute a prison designed to crush one's spirit. I never viewed this condition as a mere moral failing or a defect of character, but rather as a clear sign that the vital, radiant energy of youth had failed to find a mature, conscious container through which it could safely express itself. The third expression is the divine child. This aspect represents the highest creative, spiritual, and intuitive potential inherent in the human soul. It is that untarnished part of us that retains an unshakable sense of the mystery of existence, the part that looks upon the world not as a problem to be solved, but as a sacred phenomenon bursting with infinite possibilities. It is the true source of our sudden flashes of genius, our capacity for profound empathy, and our ability to experience unadulterated joy. Yet tragically, in the vast majority of men and women, this divine spark is completely smothered by the suffering of the wounded child and the chaotic evasions of the eternal child. Lacking a safe space to emerge, the divine child retreats into the deepest caverns of the unconscious, leaving the adult feeling utterly drained, cynical, and hopelessly disconnected from any sense of higher purpose. The vast majority of modern individuals live almost exclusively under the harsh tyranny of their wounded child, navigating their lives from a desperate state of emotional lack and primal survival. We look to our romantic partners to act as the ideal mothers and fathers we never had. We react to minor social slights as if they were mortal threats to our existence, and we blindly repeat the tragic stories of our ancestors. This is not a sign of moral weakness. It is the direct consequence of a master archetype working through you without your conscious awareness. To learn to name these children when they arise, to catch them in the act as they take the steering wheel of your mind, is the absolute prerequisite for psychological freedom. But to accomplish this, we must first confront the elaborate system of artificial masks we have constructed to hide this child from the world. From the very dawn of our conscious lives, we are subjected to a subtle and relentless form of conditioning. We are taught that certain natural emotions are unacceptable, that feeling things too deeply is a dangerous liability, that tears are an embarrassing sign of weakness, and that needing the comfort of another is shameful. As we grow, this emotional suppression, enforced through subtle social punishments and parental anxieties, compels us to construct elaborate defenses. We fashion masks. We put on the heavy armor of invincibility, total rational control, radical independence, and artificial maturity. We build an acceptable persona, a polished public self, carefully designed to win approval, perform duties, and dodge the terrifying prospect of rejection. Yet, this social self is so often a hollow vessel built upon the systematic betrayal of the living child within. This artificial suppression, carried out under the respectable banner of growing up, stands as one of the primary origins of modern psychological decay. You must realize that repression never destroys an emotional energy, it merely buries it alive. What the conscious mind refuses to face, the body and the unconscious are forced to carry. Repressed anger transforms into ambient, chronic anxiety. Ignored emotional needs solidify into uncontrollable compulsions. Stifled vulnerability mutates into destructive addictions, unexplained physical illnesses, and acts of unconscious self-sabotage. In our desperate quest to hide our wounds, we become master architects of our own imprisonment. Consider the forms these masks take in our everyday lives. There is the mask of the hyper-responsible caretaker, the person who tirelessly tends to the needs of everyone in their orbit while completely neglecting their own suffering. This individual is driven by a wounded child who learned early in life that they possess no intrinsic worth, believing they are only entitled to love if they make themselves indispensable. There is the mask of the stoic conqueror, the individual who claims to need no one, who refuses to show weakness, and who tackles every life crisis in absolute isolation. Yet beneath that cold exterior lies a child who was forced by tragic circumstances to grow up far too soon, learning that vulnerability brings only devastation. And then there is the mask of the relentless overachiever, the person who climbs from one peak of success to the next, driven not by genuine passion, but by the frantic need to prove their value to parents who never truly saw or validated their soul. These masks are our desperate attempts to secure safety in a world that once punished our authentic nature. But the tragedy is that these very strategies sever our connection with the source of our vitality. They widen the terrifying chasm between who we pretend to be and who we truly are. As this gap widens, an immense inner emptiness takes hold, a cold void that we frantically try to fill with hyperconsumerism, endless digital distractions, hollow romantic conquests, or superficial intellectualizing. Yet none of these external remedies can alter the fundamental psychic reality. The child within does not die. It waits. It waits in the dark with incredible patience, longing to be recognized, heard, and embraced. And until that moment arrives, it will continue to disrupt your life. It does not do this out of malice, but out of sheer survival, because sabotage is the only remaining language it possesses to force the conscious mind to turn around and pay attention. Many people spend their entire lives caught in this grueling conflict. They imagine that the solution to their suffering is to become even tougher, more productive, and more rigidly rational. They fail to see that what their soul is starving for is the exact opposite: gentle receptivity, quiet listening, and radical presence. They lack an internal figure capable of offering the unconditional love and protection that was missing in their formative years. They lack what I termed the internal paternal ego, a conscious structure within the mind capable of becoming a wise, loving parent to one's own wounded nature. If this inner child is indeed an active, inescapable force within our psyches, how are we to live with it without becoming helpless victims of its ancient pain? The answer is profoundly simple, yet demands immense courage. It is not a matter of trying to crush the child through willpower, but of developing an adult consciousness capable of parenting it. We must build within ourselves an internal paternal ego, a strong, benevolent inner authority that acts as an ideal parent, offering the safety, boundaries, and deep validation that the external world failed to provide. True emotional maturity does not mean putting away childish things in a spirit of contempt. It means establishing a conscious, compassionate relationship with them. This requires the cultivation of a specific state of mind, conscious self-welcoming. The internal paternal ego is the capacity to step back and become an objective, loving observer of your own psychic landscape. It allows you to notice the exact moment your inner child has seized control of your emotions. Instead of falling into a blind, impulsive reaction or brutally condemning yourself for feeling weak, you step in and initiate an internal dialogue. You say to that panicked part of yourself, "I see your agony, I feel your fear. I am here now, and I will not run away." Consider how this transforms your daily existence. Suppose someone speaks to you with sharp criticism or cold indifference. Instantly, an intense, disproportionate wave of anger or crushing despair surges through your chest, urging you to strike back or retreat into a dark room. If you possess a developed paternal ego, you do not simply act out this storm. You recognize that it is not your rational adult self reacting, but the wounded child within you reliving a painful memory of invalidation. In that moment, the entire internal dynamic shifts. You move from being a helpless victim of an emotional storm to becoming an active, soothing presence. You contain the pain without being consumed by it. You are simultaneously the child who feels the sting and the wise parent who holds the child through the pain. This internal integration is the absolute heart of psychological wholeness. It has nothing to do with becoming cold, unfeeling, or detached from life, a tragic state that many foolishly mistake for adult strength. It is the exact opposite. It is the development of a container strong enough to hold the immense fires of human emotion without shattering. This capacity cannot be acquired purely through intellectual study, philosophical theories, or passive contemplation. The paternal ego must be forged through daily practice, deliberate intent, and an unyielding commitment to emotional honesty. Reading books and analyzing your past are useful tools, but they can never replace the actual experiential work of learning to treat yourself with the exquisite care of a devoted parent. This brings us to the profound work of reparenting, the active process of supplying the inner child with everything it was denied in its early years. This is not a theoretical exercise, but a radically practical stance toward one's own soul. It is a common fantasy that time heals all wounds, that simply growing up, earning a living, and establishing an independent life will automatically dissolve the ghosts of our past. But time is entirely indifferent. Time heals nothing if the underlying wound continues to be ignored. The injuries of the inner child remain open, pulsing quietly not just in our memory, but in the physical tension of our muscles, in our relational choices, and in the automatic reactions we pass down to our children. This is why we must undertake the work of reparenting. To reparent yourself is to consciously step into the role of the adult you desperately needed when you were small. It is not an invitation to wallow in endless self-pity or to blame your biological parents for their shortcomings. It is an act of taking absolute responsibility in the present moment. It is the construction of an authentic daily relationship with the most vulnerable aspect of your psyche. This work begins with deep, unhurried listening. I am not speaking of an intellectual analysis that attempts to explain away pain with neat logical theories, but an emotional presence that embraces whatever arises without judgment. The inner child does not want to be analyzed or fixed like a broken machine. It longs to be witnessed. It needs to know that its tears were justified, that its terror was real, and that its desire for unconditional love was not a defect. Reparenting also demands the setting of firm, compassionate internal boundaries. Left to itself, a wounded child will constantly seek in the external world what the adult consciousness has failed to provide. It will chase validation through toxic romantic entanglements, seek self-worth in public praise, or try to soothe its terror through destructive compulsions. To exercise the paternal ego means stepping in and saying a firm, loving no to these desperate impulses. It means reassuring the child, you no longer need to beg strangers for scraps of affection. I am here. I will protect you. Furthermore, this work requires learning the art of emotional self-regulation. It means developing the practical capacity to comfort yourself when the world falls apart, rather than turning to numbing escapes. It is found in simple acts, pausing to breathe deeply when panic strikes, writing down your raw feelings without self-censorship, or walking away from environments that degrade your spirit even when a desperate part of you wants to stay and fight for approval. With every such action, an unmistakable message echoes down into the depths of your unconscious. I will never abandon you again. When this commitment is maintained, a profound shift occurs within the psyche. The wounded child ceases its frantic screaming because it has finally been heard. The explosive, irrational reactions that once ruined your peace begin to fade away. The vast amounts of psychic energy that were once locked up in maintaining defensive armors are suddenly set free. It requires only the quiet, radical courage to turn your gaze inward, look directly into the depths of your own forgotten nature, and say with absolute conviction, I see you, I hear you, I am here with you now, and I will never leave you behind again.